Okay, I think we're going to get started. My name is Shanie Reichman. I work at Israel Policy Forum in New York, and this program is part of IPF Atid, our Young Professionals program. We work in communities around the country to elevate the discourse on Israel and the two-state solution. And then every few months, we focus our content around a different theme, which we call a quarterly initiative. So this one is focused on the West Bank, and in particular, the question of annexation. So joining us today is Youval Yadlin, the Mid-Atlantic Regional Director for OneVoice. She's also a member of the 2018 IPF Atid Bronfman Convener cohort, where a group of 25 young professionals from across the country gather to learn about the region and the peace process, and then they're going to take all they learned through their conference and share with the communities through various programs and partnerships over the course of the next year. She is going to introduce Jacob Magid, and I'm going to just explain how to ask questions and all those logistical things. So around halfway through the call, you're going to be able to ask questions through a couple different ways. You can actually do this throughout the call. It doesn't really matter when. You can email us at atid@ipforum.org, or you can write the question. If you see on the right-hand side in the chat box, you can send a question to all panelists. We'll see that and we'll be able to answer it. Or you can click raise hand, which should be an option down below. And at that point, I'll announce in advance, but I'll promote you to a panelist, and everyone will be able to see you and hear you as well. So those three ways. Youval will also repeat that in the middle. So Youval, I will pass it over to you to introduce OneVoice and Jacob.
Thanks, Shanie. I'm really excited to have you all join us. As Shanie mentioned, I am the Regional Director for the Mid-Atlantic of the OneVoice movement, working with college students and campuses here in the DC area. OneVoice as a broader movement is a collection of activists across the world, so both here in the US and in the UK and throughout Europe, dedicated to advancing solutions-oriented activism around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, moving towards a two-state solution. We work with partners on the ground, both in Israel and in Palestine, to be growing communities of activists and grassroots organizers in each area of the world. I am really excited that we have been partnering with the Israel Policy Forum and IPF Atid to be hosting Jacob in multiple cities throughout the US, having this type of presentation held in person in Chicago, New York, and DC. And because those cities were so limited, we are excited to be putting together this webinar so that more people can be hearing from Jacob and hearing his expertise on settlements and the West Bank more broadly. So I'm excited now to turn it over to Jacob, who is the settlements correspondent for the Times of Israel, to provide an introduction to to settlements and what we're going to be talking about today. And again, as Shanie mentioned, we'll be moving into questions about halfway through. So excited to hear from you. Jacob.
Can everyone hear me? Or I guess the panelists can thumb up. Yeah, we can hear me? Cool. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I guess it's a little bit different doing this online because I can't really see if you guys are okay with what I'm saying, but hopefully that is the case. So the way I've been doing this in the past is kind of going over a broad overview of how I kind of try to look at the settlement movement from the past 2 years I've been in this position, covering the West Bank for the Times of Israel. And from there, I'm looking at more recent events that have been happening on the ground. And whether or not I get to certain events that you're thinking of, feel free to ask questions. And also feel free to ask questions throughout if things are unclear. So I think I'll just start by giving, again, a general recap of how I see things. I think it's important to understand not just the settlement movement over the past year, 5 years, 10 years, but also honestly going back a lot further. And because I feel like we can, as millennials, we only go back so far, I'm only going to take us back to the Rabin assassination. I'll briefly recap before that. Basically, from 67 onward, we see kind of, for those few decades after the Six-Day War, where Israel recaptures or takes over the the West Bank. We see a growth, obviously, of the birth of the settlement movement and the growth of the exponential growth of it, with dozens of new communities beyond the Green Line. And this rise in terms of the strength of the movement continues and continues and continues through even left-wing and right-wing governments. And then we have what I think is a turning point for the movement, and in the assassination of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in 1995. And the reason I think that, and from what I've understood from the people I've spoken to, is that the assassination in a lot of ways was blamed on the national religious movement. Those you see kind of typically, people, if you had to describe it today, would be the people who vote for Naftali Bennett or his party specifically, religious Jews who are also very ardently Zionist. So that whole camp was kind of seen as to blame for this by a lot of Israelis, particularly among the left and Rabin supporters, for this assassination. And the lobbying arm of this movement is the settlement movement. So that was the movement that kind of best embodied what the national religious camp was about. So we saw what I think, and what a lot of people that you speak to say what happened is they went under their shells a little bit and kind of took tried to keep a lower profile for a while. Whether or not they deserve to be blamed for what happened, this is kind of the feeling amongst a lot in the movement. And that lower profile, I think, exists for about a decade until the disengagement from the Gaza Strip, in which Israel decides to unilaterally pull out from 22 communities in the Gaza Strip and 3 or 4 communities in the northern West Bank. And basically, that at that point is seen as the price that they paid for kind of not speaking up enough, for not being in enough positions of power, for not using their voice, and for not being a strong and united front, or effective enough to prevent such an atrocity. And I think that at that point we see another switch in the movement to what I think that a lot of people started referring to as Tam Idan Mitnachel Afraya, meaning the end of the era of the settler sucker, for lack of better words. And we see this gradually, obviously, and the effects of this are where we see a lot of these leaders enter into positions of power in the government, and this slowly happens to the rise of leaders like Naftali Bennett, who we've seen a lot in the news lately, and the power of his party that didn't used to have the same strength that it does today. We see just in general where settler leaders of municipal councils that are in the West Bank become members of the Likud party, the strongest party in the government today, and gain a lot of clout in more typical, quote unquote, parties in Israel. And it also, settlers describe it oftentimes as other ways that they show that this era is over, of kind of just being more behind the scenes, of that a lot of them will talk about a lot where the younger generation might have been leaving religion in a lot of ways. Nowadays people talk about that a greater amount of them are remaining religious. There's this also an interesting phenomenon of head coverings that always was a thing amongst more religious Jews, but specifically among settlers, there's this bright head covering that you often see them wear, and I think it's kind of indicative of the boldness and the pride that has been regained in the movement that might have been lost during that about a decade from the Rabin assassination to the disengagement. But also, so there's this rise in a lot of ways, but also the movement itself kind of divides at the same time, because I think there was a split, or a frustration, among a lot of the younger leaders in the movement, or just the younger members of the movement, over the inability of it's like the old leadership, the old guard, to prevent the disengagement from taking place. And where we might have had this united front before, where it was known, it's still considered to be the Yesha Council, which is the umbrella organization representing all mayors in Israeli settlements in the West Bank. where that might have been a united front where all members were showing up to meetings, all mayors were joining together for one cause, it's now very much seen as a less effective body, because everyone is kind of going on their own and kind of doing their own thing. And because the belief that we were, by being united as one, had to take a more conciliatory approach and to get everyone to get along and agree. And therefore we lost track of what was the most important, is making sure that all of our communities remain intact. So we have the rise of individual players in the movement. While there were before, it's in the political capacity that we haven't seen. You might hear of a guy named Yossi Dagan. He is the head of the Samaria Regional Council, which is about 20-30 communities in the northern West Bank. And he acts oftentimes on his own right to advance the settlement movement, often breaking with the rest of the leaders to advance his own initiatives. And he's often more critical of the government than the rest of the settler movement is. There's kind of the approach of Dagan, who says we need to be able to criticize the government no matter what, because we need for what's best for our communities. And that's oftentimes been shown as effective, because Dagan has used his clout in the Likud party to bring in ministers from Netanyahu's own party to protest against Netanyahu on behalf of causes that are in the settlers' best interests. And this was done by vocally criticizing the government publicly, whereas the current Yesha Council and the more united front of leaders, they view typically criticizing the government as something that's not so productive, particularly now when it is a right-wing government that they feel like is their best hope to advance policies that are in their best interest. So there's this kind of interesting break that we see now between like the establishment and the mavericks that there's more and more of them, honestly, by the year. And we can talk, if you guys have questions about the recent municipal elections and what the results of what happened there. There's a boost in these kind of maverick candidates that kind of aren't interested in working with the establishment and trying to like everyone get along and peacefully move forward with settlement-related issues. Trying to think of another main thing before I get into more current events. I think it's important to understand is that what I'm trying to get here is that the settlement movement is very much so not monolithic, and oftentimes it's easier, like anything, it's easier to put everything in boxes to understand how the movement works, and as if everyone is thinking the same thing. It's very much not the case. We have a third of sorry, just looking at a question. A third of settlers, not all settlers are the Naftali Bennett's, the ones that wear kippahs and might have sandals and might look like they're the nature-loving, land-loving settlers that you think of. Those are only a third of settlers are national religious. Now the vast majority of the national religious camp, the vast majority of settler leadership is made up of the national religious camp, but they still only make up about a third of all settlers. Another third are Haredi settlers. So these are people that are often coming to live in the West Bank because of cheaper housing. Granted, once they are there long enough, they start to naturally buy into the ideology, and nobody's moving there in the first place if they don't, to some degree, believe in the ideology of the settlement movement. And the third group is just also another group that might not necessarily be going as for the main reason of ideology as secular residents. And these might not necessarily be specifically hardcore settler. They might be secular. They might be traditional, if you might want to call it, for lack of better words. But they represent a third of the population in the West Bank, of Israelis at least. And if we're talking about between 400 and 450,000 total settlers, so a third are split up into these three groups. So again, I think that kind of just helps understand where it's better to understand it as, honestly, that don't think of it as all one monolithic group, as hard as that often is to do. I think that backdrop of where we've been coming from and how that split has occurred and what that split is now looking like, I think hopefully that is a little bit more clear. I guess right now, how are we doing on time?
We have about 10 more minutes until we had planned to open up to questions, but I do see that we have a couple questions coming in already. If you want to address those now or hold those until we open up and move into the Q&A portion.
Okay, let me just see, look at the, how do I go to them? Sorry, I'm trying to find the, can't get to the questions. It disappeared for a second.
Oh. I can summarize them as well if necessary.
I got them. Okay, these are very specific, so I think I'll get to them at the end, if that's okay. Prince, that's the person who wrote it. So I thought what I do now is kind of briefly go over, I guess, a couple incidents that have been, a couple of interesting events that have been happening over the past few months. I recommend that if you're interested in talking about like the recent coalition crisis, feel free to ask about that afterwards. I'm happy to answer it. I think that just might be easier because I do want to use these the mapping system from the Washington Institute that they put together, which I think is really neat to help kind of show you guys on the map kind of where certain things are. I apologize if this is kind of confusing, but hopefully I'm going to share my screen and then hopefully things will be more clear. But what I wanted to do is talk about an outpost called Mitzpeh Kramim. And I'm going to show you guys on the, I'm going to share my screen and show you guys, let's see, is my screen being shared? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay.
Now we can all see it.
Okay. So, sorry, kind of just jumping into things right now, but okay. So, I'm talking about Mitzpeh Kramim, which is located right around here. Oh, perfectly. Okay. So it's located in the middle of the West Bank. See that? And basically, it's what's called an outpost. So for those who don't know, there's a difference between a settlement and an outpost in terms of in the way that the Israeli government is concerned. From the Israeli government's perspective, the settlements are what have been approved by the Israeli government, whereas outposts are not. They're built on their own volition by settlers, oftentimes still with the tacit approval of the Israeli government. They might be getting funding through various ministries or from the JNF or various other quasi-government arms, but they're not technically approved by the government, and they're not built with any permits. Okay, so there's this outpost called Mitzpeh Kramim, and it's in the middle of the West Bank, and it was established in 1999 on land that was granted by the Settlements Division. The Settlements Division is another arm of the semi-governmental organization called the World Zionist Organization. And basically the World Zionist Organization is, before the state was founded, would kind of buy lots of land and then sell it to various organizations or people for use. And it still exists today. It's the way that the land is used in the West Bank is honestly very confusing, and it's probably not something that I want to get into too much. But basically, this quasi-government organization that the WZO has now become part of the government in a somewhat superficial level, in 1999 decides to give land to a group of settlers to live in this area, and they call it Mitzpeh Kramim. And shortly after they give up this land and the settlers move in, about 80 families at this point, the civil administration, which is the defense ministry body that runs kind of civil affairs in the West Bank. Now remember, because the West Bank Israel hasn't annexed it, so it's under military control. So there's this defense ministry body called the civil administration, which kind of authorizes all the construction and building permits that are given in the West Bank. So the civil administration does a survey of the land and realizes actually that it doesn't actually belong to the state. It doesn't belong to, the WZO gave land that didn't actually belong to them. So that happens shortly after 1999. And in 2011, so a while after, a group of Palestinians come in and say, well, that's actually our land. It's not just somebody else's land, this is our land. So they petitioned the High Court demanding that the settlers that are still actually living there be removed from the land and the land be given to them. In response to this petition, hopefully I'm being clear, the settlers on their own right come and make their own petition to the Jerusalem District Court, which is a lower level court than the High Court of Justice, right? And they basically say, well, it's not our fault that we moved here because the government told us to move here. So why should we have to leave? And if anything, the government should work to now legalize our community, this outpost. And what happened in August, is an interesting decision that basically the Jerusalem District Court ruled that this outpost is going to be legalized. And the reason that they use is that they say that the transaction that was made to give the settlers the land in 1999 was done in good faith, meaning that the both parties involved did not intentionally mean to strip Palestinians of their land. And so long as in the future, what this means is so long as owners can prove that the purchase or the transaction was done in good faith, then even if Palestinians might have gotten the land stripped from them, it's still okay. And as long as whether or not you can compensate the Palestinian landowners for the land is another question. Basically, the notion is that there has to be good faith. And if you've been paying attention to somewhat of news over the past, couple of years, this phrase "good faith" has come up a little bit. It's been the main one used by the government to justify this legislation known as the regulation law that was passed in last February, and basically said the same thing in a little bit larger scope, but basically saying that if the transaction is done in good faith, if the land is this outpost, there are dozens of outposts across the West Bank that don't have Israeli authorization. If they were built unknowingly by the settlers on Palestinian land, the legislation said, the regulation law says that you can actually stay there. So what's so important about this legislation, about this court ruling, is that it's doing what the legislation was trying to do, but the legislation right now, the regulation law is still being held up in the High Court. So meaning that what this crucial High Court ruling did in September was more effective than what months of Knesset legislation tried to do, and is likely going to be frozen and overruled by the High Court. So I thought that was an interesting, relatively recent current event to go over. I know it's incredibly nitty-gritty and a little bit inside baseball, but I hope it kind of gives an understanding of kind of what the new kind of philosophy of this government, and it was stated by Justice Minister Ayelet Shaked after this ruling came out from the Jerusalem District Court, basically saying we've changed the discourse from how to evacuate illegal outposts to how to legalize them. And a lot of what the government has been doing over the past 4 years is to meet that goal. While there have been two main evacuations over the past 2 years, one of Amona, if you guys remember, in February 2017, and one of the small outposts called the Tiva Avot of 15 homes in the central West Bank, or central southern West Bank. But the most part, there's been a lot of work and a lot of success, and these kinds of court rulings or various other measures that the government is working on, or various state bodies are working on, is to work on legalizing these outposts rather than evacuating them. So that's kind of the direction I think the government is trying to take the country on this issue. Obviously, the settlement movement and the enterprise, there's so many other things we can talk about, and I'm sure We can also, there's the Airbnb decision that happened yesterday to strip, let's see if I can go back to stop sharing. Okay, cool. To drop all of its listings in the West, in Israeli settlements, which I think is pretty interesting, and be happy to talk about that. But yeah, that was, I thought, just one interesting, more nitty-gritty thing that I wanted to get into before we go into more other different questions. So, yeah.
Great. So we will transition now into the Q&A portion. We have had a couple of questions come in to the panelists through the chat, so I'll ask those first. But before we get to the actual questions themselves, just a reminder that there are 3 ways for attendees to ask questions. You can send them in the chat, either to all panelists or to all panelists and attendees for others to see your question as well. You can also raise your hand, and we will be able to promote you to panelists to be able to ask your question. So we will be able to hear your question and see you, or you can email your question to atid@ipforum.org. So to start, first, just a question that came in on the chat from Hillel Zand about this actual court, the Jerusalem District Court decision, asking, can and will the High Court overturn this District Court decision?
Yeah, great question. So the High Court, remember that what I spoke about, there was the Palestinian petition in 2011 to try to get to arguing that this land was actually theirs. So that ruling has yet to have been made yet. I said yet twice. So that decision could be made in the next few months. Things take a very long time in Israeli courts. Basically, it was frozen because of the Jerusalem District Court decision. Now that the Jerusalem District Court decision was made, then they can move forward with the High Court decision on whose land is it really in the first place. If the High Court decides that this land specifically belongs to that group of Palestinians, it is possible that the Jerusalem District Court decision will have to be kind of flipped and start over again. Whether or not that happens, I honestly don't want to try to predict. I would assume probably not. I think it's very rarely that Palestinians are able to win court battles proving ownership, specific ownership. It's easier for them to, in the past, to be able to prove that it just doesn't belong to the specific Israeli owners, like in the case of Nativ HaAvot, where 15 homes were demolished in June. When that happens, basically the court is saying, if it doesn't belong, we're saying it doesn't belong to Israelis. We're not saying who it belongs to. We're just saying it doesn't belong to Israelis. Which pretty much implies that it belongs to Palestinians, but getting specific proof of ownership to a specific owner is a little bit trickier because of how draconian the whole system works and how it's still under Ottoman law, and we're not get into it. But hopefully that kind of answered your question.
Great. And some additional questions that have come in on the chat thus far. There's a question focusing on the topic of settler violence. So some statistics from various United Nations agencies talking about the rate of settler violence, as well as whether or not these incidences are receive a response from Israeli police. So I wonder if you could speak to that topic a little bit. I think you're still muted, Jacob. So we can't hear you.
Yeah, you're right. My bad. Can you hear me now? Yeah, we're good.
Yes.
Okay, sorry. So I think depends on how serious the attack is. I guess that seems to be how serious the authorities take it. I think speaking with Shin Bet officials after this attack where a stone was thrown through a window of a car traveling in the northern West Bank about a month ago, and hit a Palestinian woman named Aisha Rabi in the head and killed her. It seems like the Shin Bet is taking it incredibly seriously. And I think that they even agreed to leak information about the attack, even though it was, it's still under gag order. Shows that they want to prove to the public, or at least certain publics out there, that they are taking this seriously. technically, it's not clear who threw the stone, whether it was a Palestinian who mistook the Palestinian vehicle for an Israeli one, or an Israeli one that was trying to carry out attack against a Palestinian vehicle. But basically, from the leak the sources that I spoke to, the growing belief is that it was very much an attack perpetrated by settlers. And I think, speaking to various Shin Bet officials, it seems to be this kind of attack is something they take very seriously. Who's not taking attacks so as much as seriously when it has to do with graffiti or the chopping down of trees is honestly the Israeli police and oftentimes the IDF. In my experience, oftentimes there'll be these one after the other. There's going to be these kind of price tag attacks, which are the phrase used to describe attacks perpetrated by settlers that are seen to be in response to against Palestinians or even the Israeli government or Israeli security forces that are seen to be in response to policies that are against the settlement movement. So oftentimes these are, again, kind of spray painting, rock throwing, building damages to buildings, tire slashing, and chopping down trees. And almost the amount of any closed investigations on this are incredibly high in terms of there's never been, very rarely is anyone prosecuted for these attacks. If the government, I think, was concerned about this issue, I think that these numbers would be different. But I think it's also important to understand that these are oftentimes not considered to be, they're not viewed as nationalistic terror attacks. They're more viewed as kind of graffiti and things of the like. And that seems to be how the government is treating them. So how bad is settler violence? It goes in waves. But I think if you're interested in learning more, the NGO called Yadlin has a lot of details about the various attacks that take place. Frequently they take place in the northern West Bank, where typically more ideological settlers live. And there are waves where this can happen every day, where Palestinians wake up to various vandalisms throughout their villages. It's serious. About a month ago, during the harvest of the olive harvest, where basically on a daily basis, where trees were being cut down or olives were being stolen. That was kind of happening on a daily occurrence, and oftentimes you would even see footage of it taking place with IDF soldiers kind of there, trying to push people away, but not really, definitely not arresting anyone and not really doing anything to actively prevent these kinds of attacks. It depends on the year. Other years, Palestinians have said that IDF has been very helpful in protecting them during the olive harvest against settler violence. But it's also important to remember that we're talking about a few dozen, maybe about 100, typically in total, these kind of young settler, typically known as hilltop youth, because they often live in these hilltop communities called outposts throughout the West Bank. But this represents a very small minority of settlers. Hopefully that answers that question.
Great, thank you for that. We had another question come in on a Q&A asking, how did splitting up the West Bank into 3 areas, into areas A, B, and C in the 90s affect the settler movement?
Sure, that's a good question. So I'll just go over what that meant. So during the Oslo Accords, basically the West Bank was split up into areas A, B, and C. And Area A is under full Palestinian control. Area B is under part Palestinian civil control and Israeli military control. And Area C is under both Israeli civil and military control. And what's interesting about it, I think, basically all the settlements are located in Area C. And it consists of 60% of the West Bank, roughly. And it's not like it's not like a perfect, I don't know if you can picture the West Bank. I guess I can share my screen to do that. Let's see if I can. Can I do that? Let's see here. Area C. Area C. No, right? Anyway, it's basically if you want to look at where settlements are, so the blue communities, so around them is going to be Area C. Sorry, hopefully this is clear. So like all this is Area C. And now generally settlers, the official policy of the movement is going to be to oppose anything like this because we don't want to break up any of the West Bank. All of it is under our control. Should be under our control and should be where we should settle in areas A, B, and C. But what it is interesting, I think that in some ways that they might not say this to you publicly, but I think that they've used it to their advantage is that instead of talking about annexing all of the West Bank, you hear oftentimes leaders like Naftali Bennett or other leaders in the right wing talk about just annexing Area C. And that makes it easier to swallow, and it's a less daunting expectation of the Israeli government. And when we're talking about, so again, it's 60% of the West Bank. It's not all of it. And it's even being adopted, I think, by these kinds of policies are being adopted by people further to the left, or to the left of Naftali Bennett, like even somebody like Eitan Kabel, who's a member of the Labour Party, who spoke about over the summer adopting a plan to annex the blocks. Now, I'm not sure it's another phrase of what typically Israelis would expect to be used to be able to keep any sort of deal. So Eitan Kabel says we should annex the blocks, which is where basically the large portions of Israeli populations exist. So there's the Gush Etzion block around here. There's the Ma'ale Adumim block, I guess you could call it, which she also calls to annex. Modi'in Elite, and then Ariel, depending on who you ask, also whether or not that should be considered a block, because it kind of, if you look at how far and it goes into the West Bank, it's pretty far. But basically, by splitting it into areas A, B, and C, and I think in a lot of ways, maybe it limited the settlers or the settlement movement's desire of what they would like to annex, and there are plenty of them that still feel that all of it, and all of them, plenty of them that still feel that all of it, the West Bank, should be under Israel control. In some ways, because of the limiting to Area C, where even Israel as a state accepts that it's under military and civil rule, or is military and civil responsibility under those areas, so it's not that big of a stretch afterwards to say, let's just annex them as well. Hopefully that kind of answers that.
Yeah, definitely. And to follow up with that a little bit, thinking about annexation and those, even just annexing Area C, what are the implications then for the future of a two-state solution and having a Palestinian state when some of these areas are now officially annexed and become, according to Israel, part of Israel proper?
Sorry, was I not sharing my screen for any of that?
No, I don't think we were able to see your screen.
Okay, sorry about that, guys. So can you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, so looking at the question of annexation, even just annexing Area C, or annexing just the blocks, kind of thinking through those different possibilities, what is that, the implications for a future Palestinian state, a future two-state solution with what land is left?
Okay, is my screen being shared now?
Yes.
Okay, good. So yeah, it's a good question. Whether or not annexing the blocks or annexing Area C makes a two-state solution viable. I think you want to look at where everything is on this map. When people talk about annexing Ma'ale Adumim, what that means. That's honestly one of the more likely legislation to be raised. Probably, honestly, not now because of the Trump upcoming deal of the century that's probably never going to be released, but might be talked about in the next few weeks to months. I think that Israel might refrain from making steps like this. But whenever elections are held, possibly as late as if it's November, and it's November, we could see another push for this legislation to annex Ma'ale Adumim. But if you're talking about contiguity of a Palestinian state, it becomes a lot. It becomes a lot trickier when you take that big jab out of the middle. Palestinian leaders in the past, Abbas and Arafat, would never agree to anything like this. But I'm not gonna. I don't know to say of whether things could change in the future. I wouldn't expect them to. But there are certain blocks that Abbas has agreed to in 2008. If you can kind of see, let's see. What he's agreed to kind of let back into Israel. So Beitar Elite is one of those places in 2008 that he would have agreed to give up if had the deal negotiations in 2008 worked out. So there are certain communities that don't, and Modi'in Elite is another. These are two ultra-Orthodox settlements, the two largest ones in the West Bank. So that's a pretty substantial amount of settlers you're able to keep within in any sort of peace deal within Israel proper. But when you get to places like Ariel, which also has about 30,000 people, 20,000 people, sorry, pretty big difference, that Israelis oftentimes include among the blocks, so-called, that stretch pretty deep into the West Bank. And if you're talking about, you obviously want the peace between Israel and the Palestinians to last, and it's hard for a government to be able to govern if all these little blue blotches, even if it's not all of them, but if it's a big one like this, is kind of strutting and there's little contiguity, and that this also means that there's large IDF presence around this area to keep these residents safe, at least in the beginning of the effects of a deal. So these depending on what obviously all of Area C is going to be incredibly problematic and would never be something that Palestinians would agree to and would make pretty much any viable solution impossible. But and it extends also to smaller amounts of communities that you want to annex. It makes each one of them, obviously, it's not just the initial area where the houses are, but it's also the surrounding area around it.
That's helpful to see the map and see the way that would look. Transitioning a little bit in subject, we had a question come in from Jonathan Camel about the recent coalition, I guess, crisis, chaos, whatever you would like to call it, asking whether Bennett and Shaked not leaving the government maybe shows that they don't have enough power or influence as others may think.
Great question. I think that might be a very accurate statement, but what I feel like you might be implying is that means the settlement movement doesn't have as much power as people might think. I wouldn't make Ayelet Shaked and Naftali Bennett synonymous with the settlement movement. I think if you notice that this issue was almost not even talked about when talking about elections, the settlement movement wasn't really discussed. And I think that the fact that Netanyahu is powerful is kind of one of the reasons that a lot of settler leaders are becoming members of Likud, people like Yossi Dagan and others, and David Al-Khayani, who's the head of the Jordan Valley Regional Council, so all those settlements that are bordering like around the Dead Sea. So these people that realize it's not all, we can't put all of our eggs in the Jewish home basket. But it is accurate to say that I think that this was a gut punch for those two Jewish home ministers. I would add that I think if we're leaving the settlement issue for a second, I do think it was the right decision to make from their standpoint, because even if elections are called and we have go to elections, there's vote, similar results to what we see now in the makeup of what the government will look like, that means Naftali Bennett and Yitzhak are going to march right back into Netanyahu's government no matter what he does. So that it doesn't show a lot of spine. Regardless, he shouldn't have made the ultimatum if he wasn't able to hold it. But from that standpoint, they don't really gain anything necessarily from elections right now.
Great, and so with elections happening, seems at the latest in November, is there anything that you are kind of looking at in terms of these upcoming elections, either based on trends that you see or based on the municipal elections that just happened? What trends are you seeing as far as that is concerned?
Sure. So I don't know. I hope you guys don't read what I write, but if you do, I did a piece about kind of talking to settler leaders, talking to various mayors of towns in the West Bank about what they think about the possibility for elections, and the vast majority of them are saying we don't want them at all. And the reasons they give are because things are going really, really well. We have a government that isn't always great, and it's not always advancing as many homes in the settlements as we would like, but it's still the best it's ever been. We're having the numbers that we've had in the past 3 years have been the highest in terms of the amount of tenders that have been issued. We're talking like thousands of homes over the past few years, specifically since the Trump administration took power in Washington. So that they're not willing to really risk that, even though elections will likely just mean another form of some sort of right-wing government. And the reason why why that's part of they don't want to risk it is because when you have elections, they basically push off all the progress that's being done for about a year about a year, because you have all this campaigning that's done for 3, 4, 5 months, depending on when you call elections, where a lot of the offices are not acting. A lot, like the defense ministry, is not focusing on getting the amount of authorizations for building permits in as quickly as they would be normally. And then once the new ministers once the elections happen, then you have a period where the coalition is being built, and we don't even know who's in it. And then you have ministers having to get to their office and learn how to learn how to run things in the defense ministry, in the housing ministry, and all those ministries that are relevant to the settlement movement that are pushed off. And I think what's also interesting is that I think there's this debate among settlers to whether or not to kind of voice an opinion about this, and specifically about the most recent coalition crisis. Yossi Dagan, for example, was very adamant about pushing for Netanyahu to accept Naftali Bennett's demand to become defense minister. This makes sense. Naftali Bennett would now be in charge of all his ministry would now be in charge of all the housing approvals in the West Bank that he would now be signing off on. And we want someone like that who is a very ardent supporter of the settlement movement to be in charge of that office. But for the most part, the Yesha Council, the establishment, for lack of better words, I pushed like 3 or 4 times to try to get a comment on what they thought in the name of the organization of the elections, and they don't want to have anything to do with being shown as having a side. I think there's this kind of fear among some settler leaders of being like seen as like kind of the Jew in a way that's like looking from above and kind of like deciding. I think the left often accuses the settlement movement of having a disproportionate amount of power in the government affairs. So when they're able to kind of do that from the side or not be seen as vocally supporting one way or another, I think they prefer to do that, and they'd rather, at least the Yesha Council would rather work behind the scenes. I think it's, again, you would expect parties like Jewish Home and Likud to receive most of the settlements support from settlers, but also, I mean, they're like Eli Cohen, who is the finance minister and is a member of Kulanu. Sorry, the economy minister and a member of Kulanu, has been a very aggressive in supporting projects taking place in the settlements, specifically industrial zones that oftentimes allow both Israelis and Palestinians to work together, or typically Israelis to hire Palestinians to work under them. So basically the settlement cause is being promoted by other parties besides Jewish Home and Likud, but you would expect those two parties to gain the bulk of votes from those Israelis living over the Green Line. There are some exceptions which are interesting, but those exceptions are becoming, it used to be a thing where Jordan Valley settlements would vote for more left-wing parties. There's a settlement like Har Adar that used to vote. I think even in 2015, there was a plurality that voted for the Zionist Union, but those are becoming less and less common, as if they weren't already uncommon.
Great, that is helpful. So we have just over 5 minutes left, so this will be our final question. And it's another one that has come in through the chat that's asking specifically about Hebron, and asking, what is the solution for Hebron given some of the clashes that have happened there, and also within the broader context of a two-state solution. Is Hebron or the settlement surrounding it something that either whether Israel is willing to give it up, or just looking forward, what is a potential solution there, and what could that look like? And Jacob, you are still muted, but we can see your screen.
Okay, let me take you guys to the maps. All right, so Hebron. Can we see it? All right, so Hebron is the biggest Palestinian city in the West Bank. And in the middle of it all, we have 4 Jewish enclaves. I don't know if these are, I can't tell if looks like they are not shown on this map. I can't really find them. There's also the settlement of Kiryat Arba, which is right here. Which, let's see. This is wrong. It says Hebron. Okay, so yeah, this is, I guess, where all the Jews in Hebron live. I'm trying to find Kiryat Arba, which is right kind of next door. Much bigger. So yeah, that's Kiryat Arba, and that's 8,000 people, if that's talking about the surrounding settlement. Basically, we have about 400 to 500 Israelis living in Hebron. And they're based off of an agreement in the 90s, called the Hebron Agreement. Basically, they're under Israeli military protection, and they're in an area called H2, while the rest of the old city is under H1, which is under Palestinian control. This is where one of the main points of the conflict where it very much becomes kind of religious, and it's why it makes it much more difficult to deal with, because these are all incredibly, they're national religious, they're very nationalist settlers that live in the middle of a group of Palestinians. Both the Palestinians in the city voted for a mayor that was convicted in Israel of murdering or of being an accomplice in the murder of an Israeli. And the Israelis in Hebron, there's people that have lived there, like Baruch Goldstein, that committed that attack in the 90s that killed dozens of Palestinians. So it's just a hotbed for extremism, honestly. And what the possible solution, honestly, I don't see how, either when you have those kinds of populations, how that is a recipe for any sort of coexistence, when both sides very much want control over the holy sites there. We're talking about the Tomb of the Patriarchs, where Jews believe and Muslims believe that the Abraham and the prophets are buried. And I think, but from what I've understood from all these various negotiations that have taken place, nobody's really talking about Hebron remaining under Israeli control. I mean, look at where it is in the West Bank. There are some that might talk about having some sort of international body that would control the area and allow access to both Jews and Muslims to the holy sites there. It's obviously a very sensitive topic to both peoples because of its religious significance. But if you're talking about some sort of two-state solution where it sees Palestinians having some viable state, you can't keep making various exceptions around the West Bank, especially when they go deeper and deeper for what should remain under Israeli control. Obviously, it's something that's painful for many Israelis to have to let go of. But having served in Hebron, I can tell you it's not a recipe. It's not a recipe for any sort of peace. What's going on now, where kind of the Palestinians there are Palestinians that live around the Israelis in H2, their movement is incredibly restricted. There's the whole economy of that area has been totally trashed because the shops have been closed down since the massacre, the Baruch Goldstein massacre, in the 90s. Yeah, I guess that'll be my answer to that. Sorry, it's not so optimistic.
Well, thank you, not only for that specific answer, but just for joining us again. We really appreciate all of your insight. And so it's been wonderful to be able to have this conversation take place in a digital format so that more people have been able to join and hear your expertise. And as well, I wanted to extend a thank you for all who have joined us in this conversation and asked such great questions. I know I certainly learned a lot, and so I appreciate all of the questions that have been asked today. So now I turn it over back to Shanie for some final words.
Thank you all for joining us. On behalf of Israel Policy Forum and IPF Atid, we're really grateful to have Jacob joining us and Youval moderating. I'm going to send out a bunch of resources so you guys can keep up with our work: Israel Policy Pod, Israel Policy Exchange, Capitol Column, etc. Please join our IPF Atid Facebook group as well so you can stay up to date in all of our work. And happy Thanksgiving. Bye, everyone.
Thank you all.